Hey, Cypher here. Today, I thought we would go over what has probably been the most denounced history movie of the last couple decades, Pearl Harbor. Everyone's made fun of it, even I have in the past. Heck, I don't think I've seen the nostalgia critic go more ballistic on any other film, and that's saying something.
You have to actually represent these people as best as humanly possible, you son of a bitch!
So this should be like shooting fish in a barrel, if I had watched it just to do a review. But I've got a bigger question. Why do people hate this movie so much more than anything else I cover on this channel? Why is Braveheart or The Revenant beloved movies for some people, whereas this movie is so easily relegated to the dustbin? If anything, I'd say it's actually more accurate than a lot of movies I review on this channel. So what did Michael Bay, the director of this movie, miss on this?
I have no idea if we can do this movie. I don't want to do it unless we can do it right and we can create the world as real as possible.
Wrong!
This is going to be a deep dive into what is wrong here. But before I dive into that abyss, let's talk about the attack on Pearl Harbor, as in the real one. I think most people are aware of the attack on Pearl Harbor.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
But they probably see it from the American perspective that it was completely unprovoked, or that the Japanese were mad that we cut off their oil that we were selling them. But the whole unprovoked part of that is a remnant of wartime propaganda. Hell, by December of 1941, much of the top brass in the US military were actively planning for a Japanese attack. Kind of difficult to be completely surprised if you know it's inevitable. So why did the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor? It's actually a point of contention, so I'll try to do that question a brief bit of justice. The US and Japan had actually been allies for decades prior to the 1930s. They were allies during the Boxer Rebellion, World War I, and the Russian intervention. They even let Teddy Roosevelt arbitrate the peace agreement between Russia and Japan in 1905. But something changed over the course of the 1920s. Japan's expansionism began to challenge US predominance in the Pacific. They captured Manchuria in 1932 under false pretexts, as a League of Nations report revealed. The newly reformed Chinese government under the Kuomintang were favored by the US too, so that didn't help the perception that Japan's empire building was something wrong and needed to be curtailed. A few years later, at a naval disarmament conference, because of this antipathy, the US and Britain refused to sign for the Japanese to maintain a navy the same size as theirs. Japan walked out of the conference. Then, in 1937, Japan again invaded China, but this time with the intent of seizing the whole country. In the midst of this, the Japanese destroyed an American Navy ship called the USS Panay, supposedly because they had accidentally identified it as Chinese. Much like the Lusitania 22 years prior, this angered the US, but isolationism kept the US from joining what would become World War II. Instead, the US began to exercise trade embargoes on Japan. These escalated when World War II broke out in Europe, and the US sent increasing aid to an enemy of a Japanese ally. The US went so far as to break a trade treaty that had been in force since 1911. And then, Japan invaded Indochina. The US cut off all trade with Japan in response. Since oil from the US made up about 80% of Japan's supply, this was devastating to the Japanese military-industrial complex. From that point onward, everyone understood conflict between Japan and the US was inevitable. They spent almost an entire year trying to negotiate peaceably with the US, but American diplomats were adamant about curtailing Japanese expansion. The embargo would hold, and Japan was getting desperate. They made a final attempt at negotiations and then pulled out. The US had seen this for a couple of years, and even instituted a peacetime draft in 1940. They had of course been aiding the British during the Battle of Britain, and sending arms and munitions to the Allies through the Lend-Lease Act. American agents had managed to decrypt the Japanese diplomatic cipher machine, codenamed Purple. They had even created a voluntary group of fighter pilots who went into Burma to help the Chinese fight the Japanese as a proxy war. 2 weeks after the negotiation deadline hit, Japan decided to attempt to cripple American forces in the Pacific, in the hope that it would stop America from being able to wage war against Japan in any significant way. Because of the Purple Machine decryption, American officials knew about the incoming attack before the Japanese ambassador could decipher his own message. Due to bad weather, they had to send the warning through Western Union, and it did not arrive in Pearl Harbor on time. On December 7th, 1941, they first attacked Pearl Harbor and began conquering Wake Island. The first shots were actually fired by Americans at Japanese midget subs trying to enter the harbor, but the Japanese won a huge victory overall. Half a day later, they invaded Guam and the Philippines. Their ruse failed to cripple US power in the Pacific, and served as an impetus for the US to join World War II. Japan's declaration of war was given over less than an hour after the attack began, but it was technically afterward, and therefore an illegal attack according to international treaty. The US declared war the very next day, even while fighting was raging in Guam, the Philippines, and Wake Island.
To overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
The General Staff decided to organize a symbolic counterattack. A crack troop of men secretly trained to fly B-17s off an aircraft carrier, a difficult feat. They got as close to the main Japanese islands with carriers in mid-April of 1942, and flew a surprise bombing raid under the command of Jimmy Doolittle, landing in China because they couldn't fly back. The Doolittle raid was fairly ineffectual militarily, but it drove the meaning home to the Japanese High Command, telling them, "The United States of America has not been beaten by your attacks, we will defeat you." And so they did. 3.5 years later, after pushing the Japanese back island by island, and finally attacking the mainland with more bombing raids, culminating in 2 nuclear strikes, the US defeated Japan. You know this movie's bad. I know it's bad. Hell, Team America World Police knows it's bad.
I miss you more than Michael Bay missed the mark when he made Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor sucked just a little bit more than I miss you.
So let's just do this quickly and enumerate all its flaws as best I can in a rapid-fire section. I haven't been very forgiving of Michael Bay's other work, and I don't intend to here, but this movie is surprisingly less juvenile than his other historical movies. If you want to skip over this and get to the juicy analysis, rather than just hear me complain about every inaccuracy I can find, jump to this point in the video.
They don't have time for bullshit, and neither do I.
Move along.
Move along. Move along.
This is going to be long, because there's a lot just plain wrong with this film. Ready? Let's see how angry I get. Okay, right out of the gate, the movie opens with a crop duster spraying in what it says is 1923, even though the first commercial crop dusting venture wasn't started until a year later. Michael Bay shows Pershing tank footage as though it were Germans. Dude, if you're gonna show some actual footage, find some actual footage of Germans, you idiot.
The British have accepted you into the Eagle Squadron. You're on your way to England tomorrow if you still want to go.
The US was officially neutral, so no one in the military was allowed to join the British. This is a central plot point in the film. It even shows the main character arriving in Britain with his American uniform on, specifically to report for flight duty. That's a load of bullshit, and does not show who these people really were. The Eagle Squadrons were Americans who volunteered to help the British, but if a US soldier showed up in his uniform, he would have been liable to cause an international incident, and probably be prosecuted under the Neutrality Act. Seriously, this is a flagrant violation of what these people stood for, because American governmental authorities actively discourage citizens from volunteering.
Just for the record, I'm supposed to ask you to reconsider.
This simply couldn't happen, and it's insulting to anyone who did serve in one of the Eagle Squadrons. It's lucky Bay didn't get up the nerve to try to show the Queen Mary's interior here. It's shown in this movie as if she were still a cruise ship.
We're dressing for cocktails and walk into the Grand Salon. No one's talking about war, they're just...
But during the war, since she became the HMS Queen Mary, as in His Majesty's ship, you know, a naval vessel, it seems like a minor detail, but it completely ruins the already mind-numbingly boring romance that is supposed to be happening here.
I thought I'd come in on my day off, work on my new invention, the Goose Cruise Fin. I'm gonna be a rich fella. Every surfboard in the nation's gonna need one.
The surfboard fin had been invented in 1935, not 6 years after the fact. Why even include that? Then, Bay is insulting to everyone who served on the Allied side to fluff up American egoism.
A lot of people frown on the Yanks for not being in this war yet. I'd just like to say, if there are many more back home like you, God help anyone who goes to war with America.
Now, it's true that the British desperately wanted the US to join the war, but he depicts their war effort as if it is just treading water, waiting for America to come save the day.
It's from the Americans. They want to organize a counter-offensive.
It's about bloody time. What do they plan to do?
Even the planes being shown are an insult. The insignia indicates that it is one of the Polish squadrons, which were units of the Polish Air Force formed in foreign territory, especially Britain, with the express intent of fighting the people who were occupying their homeland. Britain was not just waiting for American intervention, she was fighting for her life, with only volunteers from other countries to help her. And that's the wrong Navy Department building for 1941.
Just don't do what he did. What do you call it when you flip over?
A barrel roll?
Wait. It's a common misconception, but that's not a barrel roll. That's an aileron roll. When the fighting starts, Bay shows this. In the middle of the fighting, do you really have to show this? What the hell, asshole? Why do so many newer movies have to make combatants into blithering idiots? Rather than people who are trying to survive. Most people actually remain calm under fire, yet we're shown time and time again these portrayals of people freaking the hell out, man. It's on a similar point that the nostalgia critic blew up in anger.
Wait a fuck!
And yeah, that is kind of warranted. Though I do want to point out something interesting here. The critic is correct that naval personnel were expected to be able to swim by this point in time. But that wasn't always the case. There actually was a time in which most naval personnel couldn't swim, and falling into the water was akin to a death sentence. That's why walking the plank was such a big deal. But yeah, by 1941, that was no longer the case. The movie, from most of the beginning, actually portrays the Japanese, if not sympathetically, at least ambiguously, which is a good thing. But it veers hard into demonization when it depicts a hospital getting attacked, which the Japanese did not do at Pearl Harbor. One staff member of the hospital there was killed in the fighting, and that was by a piece of debris hitting him while he was trying to get to the hospital. Showing a nurse being killed as if the audience is supposed to be sorrowful about a character no one cares about is not only inaccurate, it's asinine. That's not how bullets work. Movies love this trope of shooting people deep underwater, but it was standard in underwater demolition training during the war to have people go underwater like this precisely because bullets lose momentum rapidly in water. Franklin Delano Roosevelt would not have been surprised by the news because he was informed about the Japanese attacks hours before they happened. This big scene where FDR proposes the Doolittle raid while all the rest of the staff try to say it's impossible is almost the opposite of reality. General Marshall and Admiral Stark proposed it, and had to convince FDR. So this big dramatic thing where he stands up is dumb. Besides, the entire nation saw him standing when he made the speech that drove Congress to declare war. He could stand, but with some huge caveats, of course. They show the girlfriend trying to pay attention to the Doolittle raid in Hawaii as it happened. That goes against everything the raid was about. Because they depended on the element of surprise, they went without transmitting radio signals, so no one in Hawaii could possibly have been keeping track. Furthermore, the raid was a closely guarded secret. Most people in the US didn't know it had happened until the Japanese radio propaganda announcing it informed Americans. Seriously. That's how much of a surprise attack it was, and that was the point of it. This whole girlfriend scene undercuts everything. When the raiders left from the carrier, they did not fly all bunched up like this. The movie makes it seem like the Doolittle raid was a concentrated and highly effective attack, making an effective counterstrike in return for Pearl Harbor. Whereas these guys flew scattershot, barely did any significant damage, and many crashed and died in the process. They were there to send a message to Japan, not destroy their war-making effort. If we could bomb them this well, why would we have bothered to invent the B-29 and the nuclear bomb? We could have just bombed the crap out of them from the get-go. This movie has no idea what the Doolittle raid was even about. But Bay has to kill off one of the stupid love triangle he has made for this. Buddy, nobody cares about your lame-ass love triangle bullshit. And finally, none of the Doolittle raiders who died had their bodies returned to the United States during the war. They were interred in China and only brought back after the war. Oh, and one last thing. Yes, a lot of the aircraft are wrong, and the ship's in the wrong configuration, or the wrong ones altogether. But none of that changes the narrative, and I've already listed the stuff I think matters. All that stuff about like conning towers being on starboard rather than port sides of ships or whatever are accessible if you care. With all that being said, why would anybody greenlight this egregious script? What made this farce happen in the first place? Well, that's easy. The studio wanted to capitalize on that sweet, sweet moolah that Titanic had swept in only 5 years prior. So why not do it about an even bigger disaster, with an even more vapid romance to distract from the lack of fidelity? But really, why not? Why not? Because it's Pearl Harbor. It is one of the worst military disasters in American history, and you want to turn it into a love story? In Titanic, the bad guy is some throwaway villain who's unlikable because he's rich, and ultimately, the real bad guy is an iceberg. Pearl Harbor, on the other hand, it is the Japanese. Real people. Furthermore, unlike the Titanic, where most people couldn't remember it at the time, nor were they particularly affected by the disaster, Pearl Harbor changed the world and is still a lingering memory. It brought the US into World War II, which is kind of a dividing point in world history, especially American history. We are all deeply affected by that. Many of us have very personal ties to that. I had 3 out of 4 grandparents who served during the war. One of which happened to be in the Philippines when they were attacked just a few hours after Pearl Harbor. Even worse, Bay stole his main characters from real-life people. There were 2 actual fighter pilots who managed to take off during the Pearl Harbor attack and fight the Japanese, taking out a few Zeros in the process. So we all have reason to be angry with Michael Bay trying to pervert this story into his own juvenile narrative. Plus, it's not even any good. The whole thing is irksome, like a 14-year-old tried to write a love story after just having started his first relationship, but then decided to wrap it into a story about the 9/11 attacks. Of course it was doomed to be utter tripe. But I bring up those attacks for a reason. You see, this movie probably wouldn't have gone down as one of the worst history films of all time if it weren't for what happened only 3.5 months after it was released in theaters. That's right, Pearl Harbor, the movie misappropriating the real-life surprise attack that changed the world, came out just in time for the September 11th attacks to overshadow it. Yeah, now you get it. People jumped on the hate wagon for this one. You see, I don't really think it's much worse than a lot of the stuff I review on this channel. It's certainly no Oliver Stone movie, not by a long shot. Just Michael Bay letting his juvenile filmmaking get a hold of another historical narrative. Plus, it is historical fiction about Pearl Harbor. It doesn't even say based on a true story, or inspired by actual events, or whatever floats your boat. I can be a lot more forgiving when a movie intentionally distances itself and the viewer from the truth. Don't get me wrong, it's bad, as I've enumerated, but not worse than a lot of other stuff. I see people in the comments on other episodes constantly saying stuff like these. But then everyone complains about the accuracy of this movie. It's better than Braveheart, Last Samurai, or The Revenant. Yet people are forgiving of those movies.
You call it an homage, sir. A what? An homage, sir. That's bullshit, Macaulay!
So why are people so concerned about accuracy on this one movie and willing to forgive worse ones? Well, I think it's that feedback loop of anger. People who were genuinely insulted by the inaccuracies spoke up, many of which are from what we in America call the Greatest Generation. Their complaints got amplified by the 9/11 attacks, and finally, internet videos like this one keep fanning the flames. It's become trendy to hate this movie. Yet the movie actually did well in theaters, and even won an Oscar, though that doesn't seem to mean anything anymore.
For Suicide Squad, Alessandro Bertolotti.
It's a bad movie, for sure, but it is just one among many. A part of a problem, and not the worst example. Not by a long shot. But here's the thing that's gotten lost in all of this. There already was a good Pearl Harbor movie. And it came out in 1970, when a good chunk of the audience could remember the real thing. It's called Tora, Tora, Tora. And if I had remembered it, I would have included it in the episode I did a long time ago about good historical films. It's great, and I highly recommend it. Unfortunately, it was not popular at the time, except in Japan of all places. Once you see that, then you can't really take Michael Bay's movies seriously.
I'll bust you open, you dirty German!
I fought the Germans in France.
She's got everything.
You mustn't be afraid to dream a little bigger, darling.
Don't just stand there. Get it over.